Rome did not fall in a single day. It cracked, slowly and loudly, under the weight of its own contradictions. For centuries, the Republic had been built on shared power, tradition, and the belief that no one man should rise too far above the rest. Yet victory had changed Rome. Wealth flooded in from conquered lands, armies became loyal to generals instead of laws, and ambition began to speak louder than duty. By the time Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the Republic was already wounded. His assassination did not heal it, it tore the wound open. On the Ides of March, the Senate floor was stained not just with blood, but with illusion. The men who raised their blades believed they were saving the Republic. They called themselves liberators, defenders of ancient virtue. Yet victory had changed Rome. Instead of returning to balance, the world spiraled into confusion. Power, once shattered, does not disappear, it scatters, and scattered power invites conflict. In the days that followed, Rome held its breath. Shops closed, crowds gathered in whispers. Veterans who had marched with Caesar stood uncertain, torn between grief and loyalty. Senators argued behind closed doors, some celebrating, others fearing the consequences of what had been done. The Republic still existed in name, but it had lost something far more important: trust. Mark Antony, Caesar's longtime ally, stood at the center of the storm. He was no philosopher and no subtle politician, but he understood people. He knew how memory worked, how emotion could outweigh logic. When Caesar's funeral was held, it was not merely a farewell, it was a reckoning. The people heard of land promised, of money left to citizens, of a leader who had thought of Rome even in death. Grief hardened into anger. The men who claimed to have freed the Republic suddenly found themselves isolated. Yet even as crowds turned and factions hardened, the most important figure in Rome was not present at all. Far from the capital, across the Adriatic Sea, a young man trained quietly with legions that had once belonged to Caesar. His name was Gaius Octavius. He was 18 years old, slight in build, and unknown to most of the world. He had no great victories, no thunderous speeches, no army raised in his name. What he did have was something no one else possessed: Caesar's attention. Octavian had not grown up expecting power. His life had been shaped more by illness than glory, more by observation than command. While others chased fame, he watched. While others spoke loudly, he listened. Caesar had noticed this. Where others saw weakness, Caesar saw discipline. Where others saw youth, Caesar saw potential. When news of the assassination reached Octavian, it did not arrive in clarity. It came in fragments, rumors carried by messengers who themselves did not understand what had happened. A dictator was dead, Rome was unstable, the future was uncertain. And then came the final revelation, one that would alter Octavian's life forever. Caesar had named him his heir. In that moment, Octavian stood at a crossroads that would have broken most men. To accept the name of Caesar was to inherit not just wealth, but enemies. To reject it was to step away from destiny. Friends urged caution. Some advised him to remain silent, to live safely in obscurity. After all, Rome devoured the unprepared. Octavian did not answer immediately. He reflected. He understood something essential. Power does not wait for readiness, it waits for resolve. Accepting Caesar's name was not an act of arrogance, it was an act of responsibility. Rome was unraveling, and history had placed a burden on his shoulders. Whether he was ready or not no longer mattered. When Octavian accepted the adoption and took the name Gaius Julius Caesar, he did not announce it with force. He did not raise an army overnight. Instead, he began with something far more difficult: legitimacy. He traveled to Italy not as a conqueror, but as a son. Veterans recognized him, citizens welcomed him, not because he demanded loyalty, but because he earned it through humility, respect, and memory. Rome, however, is never impressed by intention alone. Mark Antony controlled the machinery of power. He held office, commanded troops, and possessed much of Caesar's wealth. To him, Octavian was a boy playing with a name too large for his frame. Antony underestimated what he did not understand. Octavian did not challenge him openly. He asked for what was owed, to the people, to Caesar's promises, to Rome itself. Antony refused. This refusal was more than a political slight. It was a lesson. Octavian learned that authority and justice were not the same thing. Rome did not reward what was right, it rewarded what was enforced. From that moment, Octavian began to change, not outwardly, but inwardly. Idealism gave way to strategy. Patience became his shield. While Antony maneuvered in the Senate and the conspirators fled eastward, Octavian did something unexpected. He paid Caesar's promised gifts to the people using his own resources. He sold property, he took loans, he fulfilled a promise that others dismissed as inconvenient. Rome noticed. This was Octavian's first true victory, not on a battlefield, but in perception. The people began to see him not as Caesar reborn, but as Caesar remembered, a man who honored words, a man who endured hardship quietly. In a city exhausted by ambition, restraint was revolutionary. Still, Rome was drifting toward war. The Senate, divided and fearful, sought to use Octavian as a tool against Antony. Antony, in turn, viewed Octavian as a threat that refused to disappear. Veterans, caught between loyalty and survival, watched closely. Every decision now carried weight far beyond intention. What made this moment extraordinary was not the clash of armies, but the clash of philosophies. Antony believed power was taken. The conspirators believed power should be destroyed. Octavian believed power should be shaped. He understood something few did. Rome did not need another strongman or another martyr. It needed stability. And stability in a fractured world required endurance. As months passed, alliances shifted. Words hardened into accusations. Accusations became mobilizations. Octavian raised forces not by force, but by trust. Legion by legion, men joined him not because he promised glory, but because he promised order. He was still young, still underestimated, still learning. But Rome itself was changing around him. The Republic's institutions remained, but their spirit was fading. Laws existed, yet they were bent. Offices existed, yet they were contested. The idea of shared governance clashed violently with the reality of armed men deciding outcomes. In this chaos, Octavian did not rush. He waited, he watched, he prepared. History often remembers the loudest voices and the boldest actions, but true transformation begins elsewhere, in silence, in calculation, in the willingness to outlast chaos rather than dominate it. By the end of that first year after Caesar's death, one truth had become clear. The Republic could not return to what it had been. Something new was emerging, shaped not by necessity, but by tradition. And at the center of this transformation stood a young man who had not yet fought his greatest battles. Rome was burning, not in flames, but in uncertainty. And from its ashes, a new order was quietly taking form.
Power in Rome did not sit on a throne. It moved through corridors, through crowds, through legions that listened more closely to paymasters than to principals. Octavian learned this quickly. Though he bore the name of Caesar, he possessed none of Caesar's authority. He was legally powerful, yet practically constrained, surrounded by men older, louder, and far more experienced in bending the Republic to their will. Mark Antony remained consul, his influence reinforced by reputation and proximity to Caesar's former command. The Senate, fractured by fear and ambition, tried to reassert control while quietly hoping others would do the fighting for them. And beyond Italy, the men who had struck Caesar down, Brutus and Cassius, were no longer fugitives, but governors gathering strength in the east. Octavian stood between all of them, officially a private citizen, unofficially a symbol that Rome could not ignore. He began to understand that survival in Rome required three things: legitimacy, loyalty, and leverage. He had legitimacy through Caesar's name. Loyalty was forming slowly among veterans and citizens. What he lacked was leverage, and leverage in Rome came from force. But force, Octavian knew, could not be rushed. Rather than challenge Antony directly, he positioned himself as indispensable. He aligned himself publicly with the Senate's authority while privately cultivating support among Caesar's former soldiers. He spoke of law, tradition, and unity, even as he prepared for conflict. This duality, appearing cooperative while preparing for confrontation, became one of his defining traits. Cicero, the aging orator and defender of republican ideals, saw opportunity in Octavian. To him, the young man was not a future ruler, but a useful counterweight. Cicero believed Antony was the greater threat, a man too crude, too ambitious, too dangerous to be trusted with power. If Octavian could be used to weaken Antony, the Republic might yet be preserved. Octavian listened carefully to Cicero's praise. He accepted his guidance, but he did not share his illusions. As tensions escalated, Antony made his move. He sought control of a powerful northern province, one rich in men and resources. When the Senate resisted, Antony marched anyway. This act, open and defiant, changed everything. For the first time since Caesar's death, the possibility of full civil war stood undeniable. The Senate reacted with fear disguised as resolve. Antony was declared a public enemy, armies were raised, consuls were appointed to lead them, and Octavian, still barely out of youth, was granted authority to command legions in the name of the Republic. It was an extraordinary moment. The Republic, in its desperation, had handed military power to the very thing it once feared most, a Caesar. Octavian accepted without celebration. He understood the risk. Authority gained through force could be revoked. Allies gained could turn. Still, this was the leverage he needed. He now commanded men not just by loyalty, but by law. The campaign that followed was chaotic and uncertain. Armies maneuvered through northern Italy, skirmishes erupting not for territory, but for advantage. Octavian fought not as a reckless youth seeking glory, but as a careful commander protecting momentum. He delegated, observed, and learned. Each march taught him the cost of indecision. Each victory revealed the fragility of alliances. When battle finally came, it was hard fought and confusing. Neither side emerged cleanly victorious. Antony was forced to withdraw, but the cost was high. Both consuls died, leaving Octavian alone with the army and an uncomfortable truth. The Senate no longer controlled the force it had unleashed. The soldiers noticed this before anyone else did. They had marched under Octavian's name. They had bled beside his standards, and now they looked to him not as a proxy of the Senate, but as their leader. When they demanded recognition, land, rewards, and political acknowledgement, they did not appeal to senators. They appealed to Octavian. The Senate hesitated. This hesitation sealed their fate. Octavian understood the moment clearly. Rome had reached a turning point where authority followed strength, not ceremony.
The Senate could deny him office, it could scold him, but it could not replace him without igniting another war. So Octavian made a decision that echoed through history. He marched on Rome. There was no dramatic sack, no burning of temples, no cries of conquest. His legions encamped outside the city, disciplined and controlled. The message was unmistakable. Resistance was possible, but futile. Faced with reality, the Senate yielded. Octavian was elected consul. At just 19 years old, he now held the highest office in the Republic. But this was no triumph of idealism. It was a compromise carved from necessity. Octavian used his new authority swiftly and decisively. Legal proceedings were opened against those involved in Caesar's assassination. Justice, once delayed and diluted, now moved with purpose. Rome was reminded that actions had consequences, even years later. Still, Octavian knew that Rome's troubles extended far beyond Italy. Antony had not been destroyed. Lepidus, another of Caesar's former allies, commanded forces in the west. And in the east, Brutus and Cassius were no longer fugitives, but governors gathering strength in the east. Octavian stood between all of them, officially a private citizen, unofficially a symbol that Rome could not ignore. He began to understand that survival in Rome required three things: legitimacy, loyalty, and leverage. He had legitimacy through Caesar's name. Loyalty was forming slowly among veterans and citizens. What he lacked was leverage, and leverage in Rome came from force. But force, Octavian knew, could not be rushed. Rather than challenge Antony directly, he positioned himself as indispensable. He aligned himself publicly with the Senate's authority, while privately cultivating support among Caesar's former soldiers. He spoke of law, tradition, and unity, even as he prepared for conflict. This duality, appearing cooperative while preparing for confrontation, became one of his defining traits. Cicero, the aging orator and defender of republican ideals, saw opportunity in Octavian. To him, the young man was not a future ruler, but a useful counterweight. Cicero believed Antony was the greater threat, a man too crude, too ambitious, too dangerous to be trusted with power. If Octavian could be used to weaken Antony, the Republic might yet be preserved. Octavian listened carefully to Cicero's praise. He accepted his guidance, but he did not share his illusions. As tensions escalated, Antony made his move. He sought control of a powerful northern province, one rich in men and resources. When the Senate resisted, Antony marched anyway. This act, open and defiant, changed everything. For the first time since Caesar's death, the possibility of full civil war stood undeniable. The Senate reacted with fear disguised as resolve. Antony was declared a public enemy. Armies were raised, consuls were appointed to lead them, and Octavian, still barely out of youth, was granted authority to command legions in the name of the Republic. It was an extraordinary moment. The Republic, in its desperation, had handed military power to the very thing it once feared most, a Caesar. Octavian accepted without celebration. He understood the risk. Authority gained through force could be revoked. Allies gained could turn. Still, this was the leverage he needed. He now commanded men not just by loyalty, but by law. The campaign that followed was chaotic and uncertain. Armies maneuvered through northern Italy, skirmishes erupting not for territory, but for advantage. Octavian fought not as a reckless youth seeking glory, but as a careful commander protecting momentum. He delegated, observed, and learned. Each march taught him the cost of indecision. Each victory revealed the fragility of alliances. When battle finally came, it was hard-fought and confusing. Neither side emerged cleanly victorious. Antony was forced to withdraw, but the cost was high. Both consuls died, leaving Octavian alone with the army and an uncomfortable truth. The Senate no longer controlled the force it had unleashed. The soldiers noticed this before anyone else did. They had marched under Octavian's name. They had bled beside his standards, and now
war does not begin with the clash of steel. It begins long before, in decisions made quietly, in agreements formed without trust, in promises spoken only because there is no better option. As the armies of Rome prepared to march east, Octavian understood this truth with growing clarity. The coming conflict would not simply decide who ruled, it would decide what kind of world would follow. The alliance between Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus existed on paper, but in reality it was fragile. Each man commanded loyalty from different regions, different armies, and different ideals. Lepidus sought survival more than supremacy. Antony sought dominance, driven by passion and pride. Octavian sought something harder to define, control without chaos. Together they held authority unmatched in Roman history. Together they also carried the burden of decisions that would haunt Rome for generations. Before the war in the East could be fought, the alliance demanded resources, money, manpower, and silence from opposition. Rome paid the price. Property was seized. Old rivalries resurfaced. Families were divided by loyalty and fear. For many citizens, this period felt like the Republic collapsing inward, consuming itself. Octavian did not escape this darkness. He signed decrees. He allowed measures that contradicted the ideals he once claimed to defend. Yet even here, his thinking remained forward-focused. He believed that suffering now might prevent greater destruction later. It was not a comforting belief, but it was one he accepted. As the triumvirs consolidated power in the West, Brutus and Cassius did the same in the East. They were not idle conspirators hiding from justice. They were commanders, governors, and symbols of an alternative future. Cities welcomed them, treasuries opened, legions rallied to their banners, not only out of fear, but out of belief. To many in the eastern provinces, Brutus and Cassius represented Rome as it once was, restrained, senatorial, bound by law rather than decree. They spoke of liberty, of restoring balance, of ending rule by force. Their words resonated, especially in regions less scarred by decades of civil war. Both sides claimed Rome. Both sides believed themselves necessary. Octavian studied his opponents carefully. He did not underestimate them. Cassius was methodical, experienced, and deeply principled. Brutus was respected, idealistic, and dangerously sincere. Together they were not reckless rebels. They were disciplined leaders commanding vast resources. The war that followed would not be swift. As fleets moved and armies crossed seas and mountains, Rome's fate traveled with them. Supply lines stretched thin, communication faltered. Every decision carried consequences, not just for soldiers, but for cities that fed them, housed them, and endured their presence. Octavian was not a natural general. He knew this. He relied on trusted officers, on veterans hardened by years of campaign, on careful planning rather than instinct. Where Antony charged forward, Octavian measured. Where others sought immediate confrontation, he accepted delay. This restraint frustrated allies and unsettled enemies. In war, patience can look like weakness until it proves decisive. When the two forces finally approached one another in Macedonia, the scale was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of men stood ready, many of whom had once fought side by side under Caesar's command. Now they faced each other across fields and hills, uncertain whether they were fighting for ideals, for leaders, or simply for survival. The land itself seemed to resist them, marshes, narrow passes, and uncertain roads shaping movement and strategy.
Both sides entrenched, probing for advantage, testing resolve through skirmishes and maneuver rather than full engagement. For Octavian, this period was defining. He witnessed the reality of command, the exhaustion of troops, the anxiety of officers, the silent weight of responsibility. Each night, decisions loomed that could cost thousands of lives by dawn. The name Caesar no longer felt like an inheritance, it felt like a debt. The first great clash came suddenly, driven not by grand strategy but by opportunity. Lines broke, camps were overrun, victory and defeat unfolded simultaneously across different parts of the field. Confusion reigned, dust and noise erased clarity. When the fighting ended, neither side could claim complete triumph. Losses were heavy, morale shaken, and yet the war was not decided. It was in the aftermath that tragedy struck the opposition. Misunderstanding and despair claimed one of their greatest leaders. With his death, the balance shifted, not immediately, but irreversibly. Leadership narrowed, burdens increased. The ideals of restoration now rested on fewer shoulders. Octavian felt no triumph in this, only urgency. Supplies dwindled, time pressed in. The alliance with Antony, already strained, required constant negotiation. Success demanded unity, but unity was always temporary. Each victory deepened suspicion, each setback sharpened ambition. The second confrontation was unavoidable. This time there would be no ambiguity. When the armies met again, there was no hesitation. The fighting was relentless, disciplined, and devastating. Lines advanced, collapsed, reformed, and broke again. Commanders fought not just the enemy, but the limits of endurance. Octavian held his position, trusting preparation over impulse. He watched as momentum shifted, as pressure mounted on one flank, then another. When the opposing line finally faltered, the outcome became inevitable. By the end of the day, the war that had begun with ideals ended with surrender. The resistance in the east collapsed, survivors laid down arms, leadership was gone, the alternative vision of Rome faded with the dust of the battlefield. Octavian stood among the aftermath not as a conqueror celebrating dominance, but as a man confronting consequence. Thousands were dead, cities would mourn, Rome was unified, but at an immeasurable cost. Yet, something had changed. For the first time, no rival remained who could claim legitimacy through Caesar's name or republican idealism. Power now rested in the hands of those who had proven they could hold it. The alliance endured, but uneasily. Octavian returned westward, knowing that the greatest threat to Rome was no longer rebellion, but imbalance. Too much power, concentrated without structure, would lead to another collapse. Victory gave him authority. Wisdom would determine whether Rome survived it.
Victory did not bring peace, it brought distance. After the war in the East, the Roman world was vast, scarred, and exhausted. Cities rebuilt, legions were settled or reassigned. Wealth flowed unevenly across provinces that had supported different sides. On paper, the alliance still ruled together. In reality, the unity that had defeated their enemies began to dissolve the moment those enemies were gone. Power, once shared by necessity, now demanded definition. Octavian returned to the western provinces, where he focused not on conquest, but on repair. Italy had suffered deeply from years of war. Land had been taken and retaken, promises made and broken. Veterans needed settlement, citizens needed stability. The idea of Rome itself needed reassurance. He approached these problems with caution and intent. Rather than ruling through fear, he ruled through visibility. He attended disputes, he restructured local administration, he ensured grain reached the cities. These actions were not dramatic, but they were transformative. People began to associate his presence with order rather than disruption. Antony chose a different path.
In the eastern provinces, Antony ruled with grandeur. He embraced spectacle, ceremony, and personal authority. He surrounded himself with loyal followers and distant courts. Where Octavian cultivated restraint, Antony embraced excess. Where Octavian spoke of Rome, Antony spoke of destiny. The contrast grew sharper with each passing year. Lepidus, the third partner in the alliance, found himself increasingly sidelined. His influence shrank as the other two expanded theirs. Power was no longer a triangle, it was becoming a line, drawn tightly between two opposing visions of leadership. Octavian watched this unfold carefully. He did not rush to challenge Antony. Instead, he allowed differences to mature into perceptions. In Rome, stories began to circulate, not shouted accusations, but quiet comparisons. One leader restored temples, the other lived like a monarch abroad. One respected Roman tradition, the other blurred it. These narratives were not accidents. Octavian understood the importance of image. In a society built on memory and reputation, perception shaped legitimacy as surely as law. Meanwhile, tensions escalated in practical ways. Control of territories was disputed, commands overlapped, loyalists clashed in minor confrontations that hinted at larger conflict. Each incident was smoothed over publicly, yet recorded privately. Rome had seen this pattern before. Octavian strengthened his position through alliances grounded in Rome itself. He married strategically. He elevated capable men rather than loyal flatterers. Most importantly, he placed increasing trust in a rising commander whose loyalty was absolute and whose talent was undeniable. Through this partnership, Octavian secured the seas. Trade routes stabilized, piracy declined, grain shipments resumed reliably. For the people of Rome, these changes mattered more than speeches or victories. Stability became tangible, hunger receded, markets reopened. Life slowly began to feel normal. Antony's position weakened as his attention drifted further east. His rule became personal rather than institutional. Decisions were centralized around him, not Rome. Support in the Senate waned. Doubts grew among allies who feared being tied to a leader increasingly distant from the capital. The breaking point came not with a battle, but with a declaration. Antony openly positioned his eastern court as a rival center of power. Titles were bestowed, territories reorganized, authority was claimed in ways that challenged Rome's traditions. Whether intended or not, the message was clear. Rome was no longer the sole heart of the Roman world. Octavian responded not with immediate force, but with preparation. He framed the coming conflict not as a struggle for personal power, but as a defense of Rome's identity. He presented himself as protector of tradition, of law, of continuity. This narrative resonated deeply with a population weary of uncertainty. When the Senate finally acted, it did so with remarkable unity. Authority was withdrawn, allegiances declared. The Republic, what remained of it, stood behind Octavian. War became inevitable. Unlike previous civil wars, this one unfolded across sea and shore. Control of naval power determined momentum. Octavian's forces moved with discipline, coordination, and patience. Supplies flowed, communication held, momentum built steadily rather than explosively. Antony, for all his experience, found himself reacting rather than commanding. His strengths, charisma, boldness, personal loyalty, proved less effective against a strategy rooted in structure and endurance. As the decisive confrontation approached, the contrast between the two men could not have been clearer. Antony represented the old Roman ideal of the victorious general who ruled by personal greatness. Octavian represented something new, leadership grounded in systems, institutions, and long-term stability. The final engagement was swift and conclusive. When it ended, the outcome was unmistakable. Resistance collapsed. The long rivalry ended not with celebration, but with silence. Rome was once again united under single authority. But Octavian did not declare himself king. He did not dismantle the Senate. He did not erase the Republic by decree. Instead, he did something far more enduring. He redefined it. Power was reorganized, authority shared in form, centralized in function. Offices remained, traditions continued, yet beneath them a new structure held everything together, one that depended not on constant war, but on continuity. Octavian had learned from every failure that came before him. The Republic had fallen not because of one man, but because it could not adapt. Octavian ensured what followed would.
When the wars ended, Rome did not erupt in celebration. It exhaled. For a generation, the Roman world had known only uncertainty. Armies raised against armies, leaders replaced by rivals, laws rewritten by force. Victory had come before, many times, but peace had never lasted. Now, for the first time since Caesar crossed the Rubicon, there were no competing standards, no rival commanders claiming legitimacy. All power rested in the hands of one man. Octavian understood the danger of that moment better than anyone alive. He had seen what happened when Rome feared a king. He had watched how swiftly admiration turned into resistance, how absolute power invited absolute opposition. If he ruled as Caesar had ruled at the end, openly dominant, unmistakably supreme, Rome would eventually destroy him, just as it had destroyed his predecessor. So Octavian chose a different path. Instead of seizing a crown, he offered something unfamiliar: restraint. He returned authority, at least in appearance, to the Senate. He spoke publicly of restoring the Republic, of ending emergency rule, of stepping back from extraordinary powers. This gesture was carefully calculated, not to deceive, but to reassure. Rome did not want another master. It wanted stability without humiliation. The Senate responded with gratitude and fear. They understood the truth even as they accepted the performance. Rome could not survive another struggle for control. Octavian's authority was not a threat, it was a solution. In acknowledging this, they granted him honors that no Roman had held before, not as a ruler, but as a guardian. Among these honors was a new name. They called him Augustus. It was not a title of office, it was a statement of reverence. It suggested dignity rather than dominance, presence rather than force. With that single word, Octavian ceased to be merely a man shaped by circumstance. He became a symbol of continuity. Augustus accepted the name, but not the illusion of invulnerability. He ruled knowing that his position depended not on fear, but on results. His reforms were quiet and methodical. He stabilized the currency. He reorganized the provinces so that military power answered to order rather than ambition. He ensured that governors served terms rather than building personal empires. He professionalized the legions, separating soldiers from politics by giving them identity beyond individual commanders. Most importantly, he focused on time. Augustus did not seek dramatic transformation, he sought permanence. Roads were repaired, cities expanded, laws were clarified, religion was restored, not as superstition, but as shared culture. Rome became predictable again, and predictability, after chaos, felt like prosperity. The people noticed. Markets thrived, trade expanded, travel became safer.
Children grew up without hearing constant rumors of war. For the first time in decades, an entire generation came of age knowing Rome as a place of order rather than conflict. Augustus never claimed perfection. He understood his own contradictions. He had participated in harsh decisions. He had compromised ideals to prevent collapse. He carried these choices with him, not as pride, but as weight. This awareness shaped his leadership. Rather than demanding worship, he encouraged memory. Rather than rewriting history, he framed it as a lesson. The Republic had failed not because Romans were weak, but because their system could not contain their success. Expansion had outgrown tradition. Augustus built a structure that could hold what Rome had become. He ruled not as a conqueror standing above Rome, but as a custodian standing within it. Years passed, stability hardened into expectation. The idea of civil war began to feel distant, almost impossible. Rome's borders were defended, its institutions endured, its identity shifted from fragile experiment to lasting civilization. And Augustus aged. His body, never strong in youth, bore the marks of decades of responsibility. Illness followed him. Time slowed him, yet his authority did not fade because it was no longer tied to force. It was tied to trust. When he looked back on his life, there was no single moment that defined his rise, no dramatic coronation, no single victory that explained everything. There had only been decisions. The decision to accept responsibility when retreat would have been safer. The decision to wait when others rushed. The decision to endure criticism rather than demand obedience. The decision to build systems instead of monuments to himself. These choices transformed a young heir into a lasting presence. Augustus once claimed that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of stone. The statement was not about architecture, it was about endurance. Stone lasts because it is placed carefully, deliberately, and with respect for what it must support. Rome endured because Augustus understood something rare in history, that true power is not the ability to dominate the present, but the ability to shape the future without being overthrown by it. His legacy was not immortality, but continuity. And in that continuity, Rome entered an age defined not by the rise of one man, but by the endurance of an idea. That order, when built with patience and wisdom, can outlast even the fiercest ambition.